Let me maybe open it up and take one quick round of 3 or 4 questions, and please keep it very, very brief, and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes, very quickly, please.
K.K. Roy Chaudhary. Tweaking the title of the book, if you kindly allow, how India would look responding to the subject, in response to the subject, the response of a warming India to the global world in the near future.
Yes, we'll take 2 or 3 more. And can I please invite the authors in the room to react to this conversation very, very briefly, if you want as well. I'm sure there are questions. Please.
I'm like that villager who doesn't understand electoral bonds. So, same with climate change. The little thing I do understand is that afforestation would help with climate change. One hasn't heard very much about afforestation on various panels. Also, when trees are cut down in Bombay for the metro, there's a big hoo-ha. But what about the rest of the country? Where are we planting? I've seen Missouri in the 80s and 90s, which was completely deforested. And then suddenly, I think it was the ITBP who went in, and by God, there's a sea change there. So there's a model that works. Can't things like that be replicated in the rest of the country?
Krishna, did you have your hand up? He did.
Just a comment on this debate over the crisis or emergency. So a few weeks ago, we actually discussed this in some detail and opted for the term crisis instead of the term emergency. And particularly around the time when debate was going on in England as well over a declaration. And precisely because of the connotations of what happened in the 1970s, you dropped the term climate. When I say we, I'm talking about a range of movements, groups, and so on. We actually met in Hyderabad in September, and there were 300 people from all over the country there. That's one. Secondly, yesterday there was this land rights and forest rights dharna today at Jantar Mantar. There were 4,000 people, and there were some of them at a meeting yesterday, organized by Benny and Raghu and so on. And the debate actually was the dilemma they face actually is a science, where they feel that the terms and the discourses in which 2 degrees C, and they would talk about 2 degrees C very often, and it kept coming up again and again. So the question I think is not about whether it's the problem for them is not about question of crisis or not. They understand crisis at many different levels. The problem is how the science is talked and whether that can be put in different terms and a different discourse. One final quick point, I think, because this book came earlier, is I should just comment on what's happened in the last 6 or 9 months is actually quite remarkable in terms of the way young people have engaged with the question. And there's very deep desire to know, the dharnas taking place, meetings, and there were protests in 65 towns that took place last month, by Extinction Rebellion and FF and so on. So there's something that I think will expand. It's also something that gives us hope.
Krishna?
This is again about the language, crisis versus climate change language. I think, I think there needs to be a little nuance here in who you're trying to impress with the language, because I think I see that there are kids out there, but then there are also kids who've sort of taken this very seriously and are in a paralysis mode. They are at a loss as to what are they supposed to do. I mean, I've heard questions from kids saying, what's the point going to school if the world is going to end? I mean, I think we need to be very careful about the outcome of the language, because if the idea is to turn closet deniers into believers, I'm not sure language is the problem. I think there are other problems with engaging with them. I think we need to be careful that we don't damage the conversations that we have.
Last comment from Vichita, and then we'll take a second round later.
Thank you. My name is Vijeta, and I work with GIZ. I have a couple of questions. to the panelists, including Navroz. First is the question of intra-equity. I would say, though India has been a very big champion of equity at the global level, but somehow this discourse on intra-equity has not been able to figure in the national discourse. And we keep hearing about cities as the new focus for addressing climate change, and 80% of the wealth would be created in cities in the coming time. But how will that wealth be dispersed? Basically, the whole question of intra-equity and how to push that further. Then second, whether we call it climate emergency, crisis, or climate change, do we have the adequate institutions, the mechanisms, and the agencies to deal with it currently at the various levels of governance? And what can be done to this end? What are your views and the panelists' views on that? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a round.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Start from
No, you got the opportunity.
Yeah, why don't you take it, since you had other things that answered.
Okay, the gentleman who was speaking on forestry, I think I've been born and brought up in those Mussoorie hills that you speak of. Again, large-scale afforestation is not a good idea in India. Large-scale afforestation has largely been done in lands which were already cleansed of the people who indigenously lived on that. That's where large-scale plantations happened. India needs to have a completely different way of doing forestry. I'm sure Chandrabhushan can tell you why that's essential, and that's the only way it can be done. And I think there are larger questions of, if you use forestry as the basis of finding mitigation action, you are actually perhaps penalizing the poorest rather than the richer for taking action. So there are large questions of equity on moving on forestry before you move on large emissions from fossil fuel use in industry and coal, etc., etc. Maybe I can reiterate, and you're right, I'm so sly, I'm coming back to it. I think I completely agree. The language is not about how you talk to people. That's a different ballgame. As he's rightly said, the language you speak to people is different. The language of the state and the language of the power is a completely different ballgame. We see it in how the state practices, say, control, lack of control, decision-making by turning on an emergency, say, perhaps an attack from a neighboring country, and what that can do to how we look at what's happening to us. Therefore, I was talking of the language that's used by the state to decide what shall be done and how it convinces people why this is more important. Two, there's a great challenge that while all this money, resources, conversations are coming on saying, right, equity is essential, as you said, to resolving climate change, eventually none of this funding support will actually work on things that can fundamentally create better equity. Say, again, I'll reiterate, perhaps if we were able to dismantle the concerns of, or the damages that have been caused by the caste problem itself, you would have created greater equity. You would have addressed climate change. You would have generally brought people to a better stage to be able to adapt better to all the risks that will happen with climate change. But I cannot believe that any international funder will come to India and say, I want to work in eradicating caste here in the name of climate change. So there's a radical problem in when you use climate change, language of crisis, etc. But what you're trying to do is actually creating a more equitable society. And those are very great domestic challenges, and we have very bad history on that. We've moved so slow that it's abominable. Climate change will not help that. Perhaps what climate change unfortunately is doing in certain cases, I think, is taking away focus, finance, resources from things which would never say climate change, yet would address it. It is focusing things in the direction which get internationally attracted to the tag climate change. Say, in the case, say, Chandrabhushan was talking about Churu and the people who come under, say, under flyover. Now, if I was to resolve the problems of Churu's people who migrate here, they have traditionally, but you're right, it is happening at greater frequencies than ever before. I would still have to resolve the fact that 80% of people who migrate from Churu are scheduled caste and scheduled tribes.
Does the multiple objective, multiple stressor approach help with this?
It does, but at the moment I don't think it is happening because all the international support, focus and intervention in Indian policy that happens from the lens of climate change will not acknowledge these basic inequities that we have, and it cannot address it simply because it does not internationally have the mandate to address it, and it will not be able to enter India if we try to engage with these, because these are socially very problematic areas for us to begin with.
I mean, I'm getting really puzzled here. Why are we looking at climate change as the solution to every problem India has and has had from Kingdom Come? Climate change is to sort through our caste issue, poverty, disease, health. But what we do need to address is the multiplier effect of that very impact if we don't do something about it. And we haven't even touched on disease, but at least the science that I have seen, there's a very direct linkage between disease, which again, I would say impacts everybody, but impacts the poor most. 60% of a lot of people's livelihoods and money in our country, with or without health insurance, goes towards health issues. And if the science indeed suggests that we will see newer diseases and older, more vicious diseases staying with us because of climate change, we have this issue of tackling those that it will impact most, because everyone will get sick, but for some it's going to be an issue of just wiping out all their earnings. So I think the way we have to tackle this, and I think for too long we tried to convert the world to our way of thinking and our language. It didn't work. I mean, okay, so maybe some kids are demonstrating because they picked it up because of the UN and they feel they must follow this, but climate change in itself is too difficult to define. We're struggling with it here. We're going from poverty, caste, to disease, and wherever. I still believe that the moments that we have to pick are the moments where people are totally engaged on some issue. If it's around water, let's capitalize on it. If it's on pollution, let's capitalize on it. If there's a debate around electric vehicles, let the science, I'm still confused about the science on electric vehicles. If my vehicle is going to run on that coal-based power plant, I don't know how it's saving anything. So let me also know that that car I'm going to drive, if it's electric, is going to be clean power. And let these connections, which I think are quite simple in the science, but the science is missing. I don't have the answers on is the EV strategy in Delhi or in our country good or bad, because I don't know where that power is coming from. So let's have science a little more directed. We don't need science that's going back into patenting stuff which is going to take the next 10 years. Let's get the answers today. And there is an emergency to it, but I don't need to call it a crisis or emergency, because people are going around with masks on their face, concerned about pollution. And actually, if we give the politician the right answers, which they can demonstrate that they're doing the right things, and it's not just the odd even bit or indeed blaming the farmers for stubble burning, we've missed that discussion completely. There isn't enough out there on construction. Construction does account for 40% of pollution, right? But what is the solution? It isn't about shutting down construction, how we construct. There are whole parts of Beijing that actually banned construction, and you could only bring precast concrete. Beijing today has, let's take Beijing as an example of what has worked, which went from smog to clean air in such a short period of time. And the mapping, these are, we don't have to reinvent anything here. We just have to understand how other countries solve for it. And the mapping of a city and at different danger zones, how you shut off certain things, what you do, is what we have to solve for, even as we solve for the next 5 to 10 years. So I really think, I'm impatient. I want change today. I don't think I want to be bothered with trying to begin to convert all of humanity to my language. I would rather go with the flow, but make sure that I embed everything that is critical and do it with the right science, so that we're not barking up the wrong tree, and make our choices today on things that will change tomorrow. And forests, just in this room we've heard, forest good, forest bad, what kind of forest? Why this confusion? Where is our science that doesn't tell me, a biodiverse forest works, a monotype forest doesn't, forests in these areas work, in this it doesn't, forests on wastelands is good? if we're sitting here in this room confused about what we need to do, what on earth are we going to do? So let's focus on the 5 things that make a difference, where everybody's behind it because the science is known, we know what we need to do, we know what we want to demonstrate about, and we use a language that everybody understands.
Yeah, I don't think anyone answered what people were asking. Okay.
So that's now your job.
Yeah, I mean to say, we have huge opportunity to work on Forest Rights Act and meet whatever, the 2.5 to 3 gigaton target we have done. If we work on community forest resources, work with them in terms of forest governance, community forest rights, I think we will be able to do it. We don't need to take land 5 million hectares from someone else to plant trees. Okay, so the answer is, there's already a model that is there. There is resistance in the state to implement that model, and we should be able to meet our climate goal, forest-based livelihood goal, equity goal if we get Forest Rights Act right.
But he doesn't like the forest.
No,
and he's going to write differently.
No, he likes Forest Rights Act. Okay, so now coming back to equity issue, I think the debate within the country on equity is also important. It's going to become very important because I do see what is going to happen. See, whether government likes it or not, the private sector is going to invest where it is going to be which is going to be more profitable. And renewable energy is now becoming more profitable, not because it is giving them a lot of money, but because it can be constructed shortly. They're not finding too many opposition on land acquisition, unlike coal and nuclear power plant. So the project cycle is small and they can make money. So I do see, whether we meet 175 gigawatt or not, renewable becoming very important. It doesn't mean that our coal will soon peak. Maybe it will peak in 10 years, but it will start coming down. Now, this transition has huge equity issue between eastern, western side of India and southern side of India. Because east is where coal is, west is where your all renewables, and south, the renewable is coming. So renewable is coming in your richer states. Coal is moving out from, not that coal is doing great there, okay, but at least it is providing 50,000 jobs in Korba and 30,000 jobs in Dhanbad or 100,000 jobs in Dhanbad. So equity within the country is going to become very important when we are looking at transition in energy sector. So I think that debate needs to be now much more prominent, because we will have to deal with it, if not today, in 10 years' time. Because the politician, the MP of Jharkhand, Dhanbad, is going to tell you, why are you closing down BCCL? Okay, it is providing me job. Just because you can have wind farm in Gujarat. Okay, so that debate is going to become. So we will have to deal with equity issue within the country in this transition. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done from that perspective. As far as institutions are concerned, I don't think that, I have had this discussion within CSE when I was at CSE, as well as with many people. I don't think we need to create separate institutions for climate change, because every ministry will have to deal with climate change in one way or another. Okay, so I don't think that institutional confusion should be there, that I'll have a superstructure. That will be paralyzing. Having a superstructure of climate change, looking at policy at every ministry level.
No, policy and ministries implement.
Yeah.
As against, it's not a superstructure that's execute.
Yeah, I'm not asking for a superstructure to execute. So, yeah, I hope I have answered some of them, yeah.
Okay, if people are willing, can we do one more quick round? Yeah. Are we okay with that?
Get the authors to also comment.
Yes, I think they're jumping in. I can see Zina's asking for the mic. So can we have one more quick round? So why don't you start, Zina?
So I have a comment and a question. So the comment is on the water sector side of it, and one of the big debates that we see on the international water sector is this issue of what people are calling the climatization of the water sector. And the idea is basically, if you keep emphasizing how important climate change is, there is a tendency for the political class or just the water management class to blame everything on climate change. And that's a problem we see very, very clearly in even interstate and transboundary issues particularly, where, the river's drying for a whole bunch of other reasons, but we'll blame it on climate change because we don't want to give it downstream. So anyway, that's a side story. But my real question was about how this panel thinks this whole thing is going to end 100 years from now. Because the way, with my very limited understanding of this, I've seen three kind of buckets. The first bucket is the people, a very, very small percentage, who says we'll find this radical new energy source which is going to be cheap and infinite energy and it'll solve everything. And I know Google and a few of those people are putting their money there. The second is where most of the people in this room are, which is the renewables and energy efficiency bucket, which is, and there already you're seeing kind of critiques saying, well, energy efficiency just has a Jevons paradox problem, we're just going to use more of it because it's going to reduce price. And then renewable energy, my own colleagues at A3 kind of grumble about grasslands being taken over and the wind farms kind of killing birds. So there are problems even with that middle bucket. And then the third bucket is kind of what a couple of people in the audience referred to, which is what I'm going to call the young people kind of questioning all of this, worrying about climate doom, and then going towards extreme minimalism, and basically saying we're now going to buy only 2 sets of clothes a year. And I was wondering if that's the direction in which the younger generation goes. We're essentially turning back the economic clock 40 years, because that's what we used to do in the 1970s. So then what happens to jobs if that third bucket goes, and whether you have a view of which of these three is kind of the most realistic, or... Yeah.
3 views, 3 panelists, a good chance. Thank you, Veena. Let's take a couple more, please.
I'm Abhijit from Jindal University. 2 quick questions. One referring to Ms. Kidwai. You mentioned how finance is starting to change, trying to incorporate risk. We just saw over the last week the astounding valuation of Saudi Aramco when it was floated. So that brings us question that whether only certain parts of the finance world are moving in a progressive direction while the rest of them are still stuck in the 20th century mindset, or is everyone moving in that direction? Secondly, someone already asked the question of Extinction Rebellion, so I thought the panelists or someone else would already address this. So specifically, my question is that we know what Extinction Rebellion type protests want to achieve in the West, which is dramatic reduction. But as we see it's catching on in developing countries like India, how do you see that as beneficial, or how should that even impact our governance? Obviously, we should not be reacting like Western countries, but how would this dynamic would affect our response, or even whether it's a good idea that we have that dynamic starting in India?
Okay, Pradeep.
Hi, I'm Pradeep from IIT Kanpur. It's good to hear a lot of sociological terminology, institutionalization, agency, epistemic community is nice. I'm a sociologist.
Also an author in the book, wrote the chapter on civil society. Please.
My question is to the audience, like in Australia and India, both elections are this year. And in Australia, climate was the main issue for all the parties, basically. But in India, not. We know that this is not there, but this is why. And particularly to Nitin, why media is not like very active in climate debates. It's a very old question, but I'd like to ask. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, 2 questions here, and then we'll end with Krishna, and then maybe come back to the panel.
Hi, my name's Tom Mills. Hello? Hi, my name's Tom Mills from Two Oceans Strategy. We talked about the potential benefits of finance pushing change throughout the system. One of the aspects about the Indian renewable energy sort of growth is that a lot of debt is contained in the Indian banking system from coal and from coal-powered fire stations. I wondered if there's any comment on how we manage these stranded assets and how we manage the lack of repayments that will be required in the system.
Hello. I must say that, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
I must say that I came sleepy in the room when I entered at 6:15, and I'm pretty much charged up now. It's already 7:30, I see. I love the conversation on the language. I must say that as a common man, person hasn't seen the polar bear and doesn't care that if it gets extinct, how does it affect, right? So I think the language bit is pretty important. Secondly, I was dying to hear that word political will in the entire conversation, if we are missing that entire point in the whole conversation. And that's what I think Chandrabhushan has been trying to bring home the point on. So I would really like to hear that what is it that we have seen the change in the political will, and if we haven't, what is it that is going to bring that change? Is it the democratic demand by the people? And how do we do that?
Okay. Last word to Krishna.
So I want to talk about the equity issue between the East and the West part of India, for example. Now, with all the divestment, selling off of public companies, will that make equity worse or better?
How does that impact climate?
Okay.
Public sector was based on equity. You should know that the idea of public sector was to take equity across the world. So we set up paper mill in Nagaland. We knew that it was not viable. Nagaon paper mill, I have been to Nagaon paper mill. There was no, we built railway lines, to bring. So there was, but the idea of public sector was built there, but it wasn't that you always be loss making. Okay. So I think we mixed up public sector completely because there was no incentive for them to keep remaining viable. And now there are two paper mills in Northeast. That's a beautiful story. Someone should write about it. The Nagaon paper mill and Kohima paper mill. They all were set up in 1980s to take heavy industries to Northeast. And it was there because every few years you have this rat infestation that kills bamboo there. This bamboo killing that happens in Northeast. So there was raw material, and they said, why don't we make paper out of vast bamboo, which in any case is going rot? Everything was there. Infrastructure was built. But the institutional structure of public sector was such, they couldn't even sell paper to Bangladesh, which was the nearest. Nagaon paper mill, you just cross the border and start selling paper to Dhaka. Okay. So I think some of the public sector which are being sold will have equity implications if they are certainly in the remote part of the country where it was set up to provide jobs, bring development. We have seen private sector taking up public sector assets and then just breaking it up. That also we have seen happening in this country. So it will, I think some deeper study needs to be done to understand what equity implications it will have. But I want to come to this issue of technology. Frankly, I'm not bothered about energy. Energy in climate change is least of our problems. Industry and food is the biggest problem. Okay. 60 years of research in energy, whether we go for packaged nuclear or we go for battery and renewable, we go for some other advanced technology, energy we will solve it. But we don't know how to produce cement and steel, frankly speaking. And we do not know how to produce food. So the two major challenges that we are going to have in climate change that people are not talking about is the industrial sector and the food sector. Okay. And in case of India, it is even more challenging because we are moving, as we are becoming rich, we are moving from being vegetarian to being more and more non-vegetarian. China per capita meat consumption increased from 8 kg to 50 kg within a duration of 2 decades. Okay. And the implication in terms of water was, it increased the virtual water requirement of China by about 40%. So I think I'm much more confident on energy sector, absolutely not confident in terms of how heavy industries and food sector is going to deal with this issue. Okay. Now, coming back to the coal stranded asset, the only way we can solve it is by closing down more than 25 years old plants. Currently, our coal power plant load factor is less than 60%. Merchant plants are not able to sell power, those who have the huge bank loans. And some of the most polluting plants, but that has an equity issue again. It's very interesting. Some of the oldest plants are actually, again, they were set up 50 years old, 60 years old. But the only solution is for coal, if you want to get rid of it, is to, we will have to, which will have both air pollution benefit as well as climate benefit, is to close some of the old coal-based power plant. That's the only way we can move ahead.
And then these stranded
No, no.
Right now. No, yes, right now the demand, see, the number is as such. We have 300 gigawatt of capacity. Our peak capacity requirement is 180 gigawatt.
And we may need to
Yeah.
leave it at the
So
conceptual point.
You close down 30 so that the rest of them can sell their power, the efficient one.
So, stranded assets, coal, and you're right in asking the question, is a huge issue across the world. And India, it will catch up because every bank in India is dependent on foreign funding. And at some point in our time, in history, we will find, when I say foreign funding, because they're all listed stocks and all Indian listed stocks have foreign investors, they will abandon companies that don't abide by some global rule. And we will, and I think it could be as soon as 10 years, have stranded assets. And a stranded asset is one which nobody wants to fund. We could learn from what's happened in the West by doing the just transitions that Chandrabhushan so rightly pointed out. But today, any discussion on coal is sacrosanct. That I don't believe we look at it at all. Even those of us that are in the sort of think and read space stay away from it because it is just not something which is being tackled at a policy level. But finance will clearly begin to discriminate and these assets will be stranded. And when it happens, the plant shuts down overnight. And think of what that does. So the right way for us to do it is to tackle it as a problem which allows us over time to do these just transitions so it doesn't hurt where it would otherwise, exactly as Chandrabhushan suggests. Saudi Aramco, well, the funding was ended up being at about 2/3 the value they wanted. The world is still dependent on fossil fuel. India still imports much more than we should. And maybe in time, the need for all of that drops, but it's not dropping in a hurry. So money still goes to where money is to be made. But that money is getting more and more conscious about it being clean, it being good, it being right, it being sustainable. And which is good, and it will drive change. It hopefully will drive it slowly, so we can adjust in a way that is realistic and equitable. I think let's leave it at that.
Listen.
Okay, just one point on, I think two people referred to the Extinction Rebellion, and you roughly said about kids going out and protesting. I think completely missing on the demography in India. If you look at statistics, the people you're talking about is roughly the 0.001% of the cream which is sending randomly 1 out of 1 million kids on the road to protest. Will they make a difference in India? Absolutely not, and thankfully so. I'm so glad they will not, because they do not represent India. So while they will have problems, and these are problems of kids in Gurgaon, thankfully they will not make a change to how we deal with environment, development and all that. Let me look at, again, something I'll request that we all look at when we say, what's the development challenge in India? A lovely piece that an economist called Ratin Roy has written on who do we produce for, who do we sell for. Most of our production and consumption that happens, production happens is for consumption of the roughly top 7%. And that's been the structural problem. We do not have a demand from the bottom up. We produce for the rich, and the rich have consumed endlessly over the last 15 years, which is why we've landed up where we are. So it's the same 7% which is now cribbing about air pollution being a problem. I would also suggest that there's a differential about why we are able to still find a few people talking about climate change and air pollution, but not about water pollution and waste management, is because air pollution is right now hitting home at the highest peak decile of our Indian population. Water waste can be managed by chucking it out in the lives of the poor, safeguarding yourself by putting up filters. You can't do it with air pollution anymore. So I think if we get our demography right and we understand our economic status right now, China, if you remember China, when it did this permit business of how many industries will work, was also the point where it was doing permits of saying how many million people every day need to just get out of Beijing and stay away. We'll decide who shall be allowed in and who shall not be allowed in. So at what stage are we as India? Beijing is no comparison. We need to have our own figuring out our own selves first. We do not have at the moment even a map of what are our, I mean, ironic, at there are other reasons, we do not have for the last 10 years now data on how much we consume for various other reasons. But we do not map our economy well enough to even know who are we supposed to be doing these things for. And my fear is there is, unfortunately, and this answers to you, somebody's talking about press, and I'll end with this. We are a screwed up Indian press. I mean, there's no doubt about it for various reasons across all factors. We are funded by corporates. We respond to the corporates. We are not funded by citizens. There's a reason for it. Therefore, we respond to other reasons. So we will obviously not reflect these issues. That's fine. I mean, this is across the board. It's not climate change. But I think overall, we need to figure out as elites, while we sit and discuss climate change, that we are the elites. We are not the middle class. Therefore, the decision making we're making is actually making it for the top super elite cop in this town. We are not dealing with, we don't even realize who exists out there.
No,
if you do not engage with that,
no, that's sorry.
Look at this. You have two people here in this conference who are saying, what will you do when a kids get troubled with this thing? We are really dealing with, exactly in terms of pure statistics, we're dealing with 0.0001% of the kids in this town, in Gurgaon, coming out with 17. I can give you evidence of where does Extinction Rebellion funding came from in India. The kid who filed the case in Supreme Court saying India should take greater action on climate change is actually funded, her father's funded, this sounds very crude, her father's funded, who works in an NGO, in a wildlife NGO, has filed a case because some lawyer wanted it to be filed. We are doing a bad mimic, and therefore we have to have our own movements. Our best environment movements have actually been mass-based movements from the villages. We've had fantastic ones. We've done brilliantly well against very debilitating forces of the state. These are not the climate movements that will make any difference. I think the fact that the Indian government, and I do love forests, took back the Indian Forest Act, the new amendment, was because there was a movement, literally I would call it a climate movement, of 4,000 tribals coming to Delhi saying we'll protest on your streets, and we got scared shit.
No, Jharkhand election made it happen. I'm sorry. It was not tribal coming to street of Delhi that made it happen. It was pure and simple Jharkhand election.
So why do you think it mattered in Jharkhand? Because the opposition leader in Jharkhand turned it into an issue. It became an issue because JMM turned it into an issue there, along with the left and others.
So
now,
probably should wrap up because the audience is, I think the audience is incredibly engaged. I want you to let you finish. No, I want to let you finish, but we should probably nudge towards the exit, if not stampede towards it, please. Yes. So, no, but please, finish your thought.
No, I just end with the same thing. I think if we just look at ourselves better and understand where we are as a country, in both in terms of our differentiations, and we know that the people who talk about climate change right now, including those in civil society and outside, are largely representative of the elite, we'll find there are different answers and different ways to address this.
Okay, great. Just an absolutely fabulous panel discussion. I think you'll all agree. So I'm just going to start with a round of applause for our panelists. If I could just take 10, maybe a minute or so, not by no means to sum up, but to do two things. One, an advertisement, and second, to provide maybe a couple of reflections on this, starting with the second. I think the starting point for everybody on this panel and most people in this room is that we are in many ways an ecological basket case in this country, to use a phrase that Ram Kuha used in another panel last week that I was able to listen to. And that being an ecological basket case has greatest consequences for the poorest. I think that's something that, is an article of faith for many of us. What does climate change do in that context? And in a sense, climate change can be a distraction, definitely, and that has been actually a mainstream view of much of Indian environmentalism for the last 15, 20 years. But I think it's becoming more nuanced. So the climatization and distraction from away from these things. It can also be, as I suggested earlier, on occasion, a political leg up to a conversation that ecological ministries, environmentalists, etc., were shut out of, if it's used strategically. So I think we probably need to move away from the language that climate change is necessarily a distraction or an opportunity. It depends on what we choose to make of it. And so, one of the reasons we've chosen this multiple objective, multiple stressor kind of language is that it encourages us to look at the connections, including the political connections, and not accept a certain set of political connections, but forge the connections we think are most useful for the task at hand, right? And so in cases where immediately climate change is a distraction, we box it out. Where climate change can be helpful, we bring it into the fold. And that is, it's part of, but either way, it is part of the political narrative now for Indian environmentalism. It's up to us to figure out a way to use it. So that is consistent, I think, with what Naina was saying, that we should work with the grain of opportunities that we have. So if you have an opportunity that opens up around urbanization, we have to work with the grain of that. Where if climate change is a way of rethinking public transport in India, then we should do that. I think actually my own take on the EV issue is that it's boxing out public transport, which is a problem. But again, that's a choice that we can make. We don't have to say climate change equals EVs. We can say climate change equals public transport. It's a choice that we have to make. We have to harness it and work the politics. But if we only worked in that way, I think we would miss something critical that Chandrabhushan has been striving to remind us of, which is that we also, because of climate change, need to be having a strategic conversation. There is going to be a sea change in economic structures over 30, 40 years, and there's going to be a sea change in natural conditions over 30, 40 years. So if we don't start talking about the decline of the coal economy, if we don't start talking about the vulnerability of coastal cities, if we don't start talking about year-on-year declines in crop yields, if we stick with the wheat-rice cycle, things that we have to think strategically about because of climate change, we are also missing the bus. So I don't think we have any option of thinking of it either as a short-term or a long-term issue. We have to actually think of it both ways and independently exercise the choice about strategically whether we box out climate change or harness climate change given a particular issue. But that requires both a lot of analysis, a lot of strategic ability, and a lot of institutional capacity. So the Indian bureaucracy tends to approach these things in quite a blunt way. I'll just end with a line. When I was doing research on state action plans, and I asked people, how do you decide whether something, the nature of a problem, is it sustainability, is it climate change? He says, we ocularly decide. What he says. Sort of that's sort of what we're reduced to. So we need to sort of get beyond that. We need to think institutionally about this, informed by science, and so on. So the object of this book was really to provoke a conversation. I can't think of a better way of having started that conversation. The advertisement is this. Because we're so keen to have this conversation, this book is open access. So please, I think there's even a QR code on the
I think the open access part is the...
And you can just go to CPR's website, OUP's website, download it, and please do engage with this. And I think we're all sort of part of this ongoing conversation. Thank you so much for coming and for staying late. And again, a big thank you to the panelists, and not least all the authors of this book. Thank you.